really, really fortunate today to have Dr. Saul Gittleman. He is the Alice and Nathan Gantcher University Professor Emeritus at Tufts University, where he taught from 1964 until his retirement in 2015. He served as provost from 1981 to 2002 and has received many awards, fellowships, and honorary degrees for his teaching and service. He's the author of 6 books, including the one we're going to talk about, which is here. And I would really commend that you all get this book. It's called An Accidental Triumph, The Improbable History of American Higher Education. Just a fascinating book we're going to talk about. So welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks a lot.
So when I think about your career, which really spans 5 decades, and we certainly have covered over the years diverse issues in higher education. Is turning 40 in March. So we certainly have covered your leadership at Tufts over the years. But tell me a little bit about how you assess the current state of higher education. I recognize that's a broad question. We'll drill in a little bit. But what is your thinking about where we are with higher ed right now?
Well, if you read the newspapers or listen to most Americans and listen to the surveys, we're at the bottom of the pits. Turns out outside of this country, we're the envy of the world. We have the greatest higher education system in the world. We lead by far all other matrices, all other evaluative methods of how important, how great, how successful we are. You just can't convince the American people of that. They don't want to hear it.
Yeah, and I read an article, I think just last week, in the New York Times that said like 41% of Americans are concerned about the return on investment piece, including the cost of higher education.
We do a lot to shoot ourselves in the foot. We make terrible mistakes, but at the end of the day, there's nothing like us in the world.
Interesting. So one of the things that I loved about your book is that you kind of talk a lot about sort of the history of higher ed, but you also tell your own story. And one of the things that was fascinating as I was reading it is that you talked about your introduction to higher ed growing up in, I believe, Hoboken, New Jersey, and also being the son of immigrant parents and that whole experience. So tell me a little bit about what that introduction was like for you.
You said go back 40 years. Well, I go back 70 years. I grew up, I was educated in the 30s, elementary school, and I went to the movies a great deal with my grandmother, who couldn't speak a word of English. And she used to love the Marx Brothers. So we saw a movie called Horse Feathers, and it was made in 1932. We saw 1939, 40. Groucho Marx is playing the president of an American college and needs to win the big football game against Huxley College, and he hires 2 professionals, his brothers. Turns out to be Chico and Harpo. They win the game. It's enough fun. It's crazy, but it's funny. And that's all Americans cared about in the 1930s. They laughed. Nobody went to college. Something like 5% of all Americans went to college. They barely graduated from high school. So higher education was not a subject that anybody cared about, even right through John Belushi in the 1970s with Animal House. They preferred to laugh at higher education. We're not a strong intellectual nation. We are basically unintellectual. We like our heroes to be uneducated. Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh flunked out or left in the college. That's what we prefer. We do not like eggheads and smart people. But as long as we ignored higher education, nobody cared. We didn't want immigrants. We didn't want the 1930s was in many ways the darkest period in American history, because everybody agreed to keep the immigrants out, to keep the blacks suppressed, to keep the anti-lynching laws. The Congress was run by a bunch of conservative Southern Democrats. FDR was in the White House. The left was happy, but the country was agreed with one another. It was a terrible place to be in many ways if you were of a certain kind. Higher education played no role at all. We taught eugenics. We taught race. We taught bad history. I learned about the Civil War through the movie Gone with the Wind.
Wow.
We never talked about the Civil War. We never talked about slavery. It was not a subject. The Native Americans all looked like Anthony Quinn. We thought they were all, Custer died with his boots on. He was a hero. So that was our American history. The war changed everything. And just before the war, Adolf Hitler came to power. and destroyed the greatest university system in the world, the German. But in one short decade, from 1933 to the beginning of the war, he destroyed the German system, fired all those faculty members, many of them Jews. Many of them didn't even know they were Jews. They thought they had already converted. And we let the doors open just a crack wide enough to get a few of those scientists, and we got the bomb. The Germans didn't get the bomb. We got the bomb because of the European scientists. If it wasn't for people, Fermi, Italians and Germans, we would never have gotten the bomb. But we did get it. Let in a couple of those immigrants, just enough. The movie Oppenheimer tells the story, and we won the war. Then at the end of the war, in order for a couple of 100,000 GIs not to be unemployed when they came back, the Congress invented something called the GI Bill. The American Legion supported it. They're not exactly the most liberal organization in the world. And so they said, well, 200,000 will go to college. Well, 200,000 didn't go to college. 7 million ultimately did. And it changed the whole faculty.
Wow.
That many they needed more people, and they were willing to take. Now, the American faculty in the 1930s and right through the 40s, like the Army and the Navy, was all white, overwhelmingly Protestant, and of the same opinion. So there was no conflict because everybody agreed. And they were all basically what it was. The narrative they wanted about American history. Who owns the narrative? Who gets to tell the story of American history? The story that was told in the 1930s was gone with the wind. And horse feathers. That was education. That's and that was the West. And slavery and everything else was pushed back. The war changed it because these people that came in now were no longer what they had been before. And they became faculty.
No, that's very, very interesting. Wow. So what was your trajectory like? I mean, how did you?
No, we had no such thing as prestige. My parents didn't know from prestige. Prestige meant what kind of a car you drove. There were no rankings, college rankings. Who cared about college rankings? Where I went to school, when Hoboken and West New York, New Jersey, my parents knew nothing about colleges. They couldn't name you 2 colleges if their life depended on it. But my baseball coach came home one day and said, Saul will go to Drew. It was a little Methodist college in northern New Jersey, close by to their home. They said he won't have to go far away. He'll play ball, have a good time, enjoy himself. So I was accepted before I even applied. I went to Drew. I met the baseball coach. He says, what are you going to major in? I said, what's a major? I thought it was an Army rank. He said, you know so little about colleges. I'm the German teacher, major in German. I'll take care of you. You'll play shortstop. So I go home, tell my parents I'm going to major in German. They said, whatever the coach says, that's fine. And I became a career German professor by accident, just by accident. But it was also the time when all these GIs were pouring onto the campus. They needed any faculty member who had a pulse. If you could breathe on a mirror and you had a pulse, you got a job. Clark Kerr had created the California system. Nelson Rockefeller in New York State had done that one. So jobs were everywhere. And I got my job at Tufts. And then I got tenure 2 years later when the dean put his hands on my head and said, poof, you have tenure. It was a different world. I had no review, no inside or outside review. So, and then by that time, we started winning the Nobel Prizes, but we never really appreciated it.
Wow. Interesting. That history is fascinating. And so then when you became provost, I think you must have had, obviously you had a different vision or worldview of how the academy has shifted and changed, obviously, from when you started. And I was just wondering, how did you kind of reconcile
that? I
that?
realized at that time, even that almost all of our faculty, when I became provost, were former GIs. They had all, the one who limped had gotten his back of his leg shot at on Omaha Beach. Jim Elliott was in political science. We had a professor of religion, Bob Miller, who used to wake up in the middle of the night screaming. His wife told me because he was shocked at what he had seen in Europe during the war. So they were all still part of that generation of GIs. And so it was I began thinking about American higher education and realized that we're ungovernable. I mean, everybody, American faculty are free and ungovernable. And I spent 2 years in Europe teaching and studying, and I realized there's nothing like us. But
Yeah.
every time you picked up a newspaper, Sputnik, I remember when Admiral Rickover said, we have to learn Russian, learn how the Russians teach. Well, they failed. Then the common market, learn what the common market is doing about it, and universities. Well, they didn't pass us. Then the Japanese are going to pass us. They didn't pass us. And now it's China. So we look to get past. We look to fall off the mountain. But we are so diverse in our universities. We've got 6,000 colleges and universities that give a degree. Now, 1,000 of them are Bible colleges. A third of them are for-profit. Half of them are private. The vast majority go to state universities. And so we have them. And then we create monstrosities like the gambling and the Division I football, which has nothing to do with higher education. So we don't have much leadership because they want to win football games. And that's what Americans think about college still. Yeah. They know the president, they'll know Deion Sanders at Colorado. Right. You won't get anybody to name the chancellor or the chairperson.
That's, I'm sure, very true. It's also very interesting when you think about how the faculty, and to your point, has evolved and changed over time. I did my PhD at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and African American Studies. And so when that program was started, the faculty were largely activists, right, who had come out of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And in part was, as the department was created, was to also calm some of the rioting and protests that were taking place on campus.
In a sense, rewrite a little bit American history. That's been the battle for 60 years. Yes. Who controls the narrative of American history? What are these truths, as Jill Lepore calls them? What is the evidence of American history? And the history that's been done in the last 60 years has been a different archival history. We've dug into different things. We don't use Gone with the War anymore as the major teaching tool. We've learned a lot. And a lot of that older generation didn't like it. Faculty are so totally different now, diverse. You no longer have unanimity and you no longer have civility.
And yet there are these stories that are written. We've had some in our publication as well about individuals who are considering leaving the profession, meaning faculty members. We're seeing the exodus of folks who are leaving, or others who are getting PhDs and deciding maybe you don't want to do the higher ed route. Right. Is that what you're hearing as well?
With the goal, well, first of all, there are 1.5 million faculty in this country, 6,000 schools. There's no such thing. You know, when you read the newspapers who want to dump on American higher education, they talk about the faculty. Well, there is no such thing as the faculty. On the other hand, we've overproduced PhDs. We've cut back the teaching loads. The golden age that I lived through, when the dean would put his hands on my head and said, poof, you have tenure, no publications. I had no publications.
Wow.
And I got tenure without any review. But then came peer review, internal review, outside letters, all the trappings of rankings, of importance. How do you become a research university? There are still thousands of little teaching colleges out there. And but we overproduce PhDs for prestige. Americans love prestige. They love lists. And so we've overproduced faculty, and there aren't the same number of jobs nearly that I had when I was looking for jobs. I would get job offers. They would, from California, they bring little tangerine trees to the meetings and say, please come to California.
Wow. Wow. And so you talked a little bit earlier about the ways in which our American higher education system is viewed globally. And I was wondering if, I mean, obviously lots of people still want to come to the US study.
We got 1 million students again.
Yeah. Yeah. But I was wondering the impact that the pandemic and COVID might have had on this as well. And was wondering if you can.
It was enormous because we have 1 million international students now. The pandemic was a global event, just like the Spanish flu in World War I, which killed, I don't know, worldwide 60 million people. I mean, we've always had these pandemics, but nothing with the news cycle that we have now. You know, it used to be the bubonic plague. The world has always had to live with plague. And this thing was a plague, and it spread around the world and was covered around the world for good and bad, because media is a mixed bag at best. And yes, it cut into 3 or 4 years of education of a lot of students who couldn't go to class. And it was a major disruption. And now it looks like it's under some control, and we're back to over 1 million international students on our campuses. A few colleges have closed, a few more have opened, in balance. And, they're so different from one another. We've got 1,000 Bible colleges in this country, faith-based colleges, these don't exist anywhere else. There's no Brigham Young in Russia. There's no Regis College in China. There's no Harvard anywhere else. So it's such a complex and different and varied American system, and the rest of the world knows that, and we don't know much about our system at all.
Interesting.
Football and gambling.
We do know.
We know that.
But we're also seeing mergers of colleges happening, right? We're seeing closings, mergers, that kind of
always happened. It's been that way for 400 years. The schools that were founded in the frontier disappeared so quickly. I mean, American closing of colleges, mergers have always been going on. And if 1,000 closed and merged, you wouldn't notice it too much because there'd be all the little ones. And that wouldn't be enough to fill the University of Michigan football stadium.
Interesting. Wow.
I mean, what's closed in Massachusetts?
A
couple of tiny little colleges.
So I know that during your time, during your leadership as provost, I know you were very intentional about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and trying to make sure that Tufts was really representative in a diverse way. And I was wondering, it's hard work. But we also see these attacks on DEI taking place.
Always pushback.
And especially in states like Florida and Texas. But I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that, given the current political climate? And you write a lot about the politics and the intersection of politics and
That's as American as apple pie.
Okay.
We'll always have it. And now that it's contentious, I mean, when John Belushi's Animal House came out, it was 1975, I believe. 1986, Alan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind. That was the beginning of the assault on everything that had happened to change things in the previous 20 or 30 years. They didn't want it to happen. Alan Bloom, who happened to be a gay Jewish faculty member who couldn't get a job 20 years earlier if his life depended on it, was the beneficiary of all the openness and change, was looking and saying, it's terrible what's happened. Well, Americans didn't, they looked nostalgia at some golden age. There's one little golden age that I happen to live through. But other than that, there's never been a golden age. It's always been faith-based. It's been terribly powerful. I went to a little faith-based school with compulsory chapel, and I sang in the Methodist choir. That's the way America was.
The Jewish kids singing in the Methodist choir.
I rooted for Notre Dame because I saw Pat O'Brien play New Rockney, and Ronald Reagan play the Gipper in New Rockney All-American. Those football stadiums were built in the 1890s, 1910s. There's nothing new. The 1919 World Series was fixed. So gambling has always been there, and a lack of diversity has always been there. The land-grant schools were supposed to be for women and blacks, but they weren't. And so in 1890, they created the black land grant to keep them all separate. And the Supreme Court never gave any help. It was only the little anomaly of the Warren Court between 1954 and 1967 that changed everything. But that was only 13 years.
13 years. Yeah. And so do you think this affirmative action ruling or illegal ruling is going to have an enormous impact?
It'll have an impact, but we'll never go back to where we were. But it's going to be contentious because the people are now diverse. I don't think you can have civility and diversity at the same time. Civility was in the 1930s when the whole faculty was the same. Everybody agreed, and it was mediocre, but they all agreed. Then change comes. You got immigrants, you got Italians, you got Jews, you got blacks, you got Asians. Don't forget, we locked up 100,000 Japanese Americans in detention camps during the war. The war was fought by American soldiers in segregated army. Then our military wasn't desegregated until Truman did it in 48. So the whole war was fought black and white separate.
Mm.
We're fighting for democracy and freedom and whatever we're fighting for. God bless America, but it was a segregated country during the war in the military.
Yeah.
Now, we're never going to go back to that. But
Yeah.
the mere fact that we are what we are now, so diverse, there's going to be contention for the rest of our lives.
Wow. Wow.
Because there'll always be somebody trying to get it back in the envelope.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. So tell me why, and again, it's a fascinating book, and I want everyone to get a copy. But tell me why you decided to write this.
Because Americans don't have any memory.
Yeah,
we do not remember any history. It's just not our bag for some reason. So we don't ever look back to see with evidence and fact and whatever we call real evidence where we came from. And the American higher education story is confusing because it started out only as 7 or 8 little faith-based colleges producing ministers. That's what Harvard, Yale, Princeton were. They were waiting for the Messiah. This country had been founded by people of faith, and that's what it was supposed to be. It was a Christian country. It still is predominantly a Christian country. It will always be a Christian country because we'll produce missionaries and they'll go off and try to push up in Africa, whatever. So I just wanted to get at the end of my life to go back and look back 400 years to American history of higher education and get the story straight in a nice, simple way. And I write the way I speak. The book is easy to read, and I put it away, and I wasn't going to publish it. And then 2 of my students, old students, read it and said, we got to publish it. And they took over. I didn't even want to check the footnotes even, but every footnote got checked. And they got the book published.
Well, no, it's definitely a major contribution, and as you point out, it's a very readable book. It is because you find a way to integrate your story into this amazing history of higher ed. Which again, there were a lot of things here that I did not know, so it's quite fascinating.
All the facts are factual. It's not an opinion, really. It is all of this: the land grant, the faith-based. The teaching of eugenics in American colleges in the 19th century, in the 20th century, right up to the war. And the fact Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey did something. Baseball wasn't ready to integrate. It was going to be business as usual in 1946 and 1947. That's why I told the story about Levittown, which was government funded, but it said you cannot resell your property to a Negro. That was 47, 48, 51, and 52. We were not going to change, but the faculty changed.
Yeah, yeah. So like America in general, it always has been this kind of push and pull, right?
Always.
Yeah. No, fascinating.
The only thing that changes is technology. Human nature hasn't changed.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that technology piece because we were talking a little earlier about that. And again, what was fascinating even during the pandemic was the quick pivot that colleges and universities faculty had to make to online. And of course, now the discussion is around AI and artificial intelligence. I'm just wondering, how is that impacting higher ed?
That pivot was 6,000 different pivots because there is no organizational structure to higher education in America. The words higher education, colleges and universities do not appear in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. They had no idea that this was going to turn into what it turned into, this thing with 6,000 different places you can get a post-secondary degree. By the way, over half of that debt is from for-profit institutions like Phoenix, DeVry, the whole bunch of them. They hooked Americans love debt also. They got mortgages, they got cars, they got credit cards. Now they've added universities, and everybody's angry at the universities only. Nobody cares about all the other debt we got. The universities are getting blamed. And again, it's for profit because that economic thought is always in the back of an American's head. How do I make another buck?
Yeah.
For-profit institutions saw that there was money to be made, and they jumped in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, created all these online things, Phoenix University and the rest, and more money and debt piled up. So now we get $1.7 trillion in college debt. And it is expensive, but 20% of the states still have free community colleges, and you can get a scholarship to go to your state university. You do not have to go into debt. It's prestige.
Right.
So this week, again, the Wall Street Journal puts out a list. the U.S. News and World Report, which almost died 40 years ago until they discovered rankings. And now they rank vacations, they rank everything under the sun because Americans love prestige and lists.
Yeah, we want to be at the top, right?
My kid is going to a better school than your kid.
Yeah, we want to
Why?
aspire.
Because they put it higher on the list.
Yeah. No, it is quite fascinating, and that brand becomes part of the narrative, right? The t-shirts,
Absolutely.
all of that, and the rah-rah spirit that you have, obviously, for the
Hey, man, there used to be signs in all the ballparks that I used to go to that said gambling forbidden, gambling prohibited. Well, now you go to the 30 Major League Baseball parks and the football park, there are stands there, places you could go and spend your money gambling on the ball. There's going to be a scandal. There's already one at Iowa. There will be football scandals, basketball scandals, the one and done at Duke, all of that. And the NCAA cannot control anything. The portals are open. Kids are transferring like crazy because there's money to be made.
Yeah. Well, we hear about these, prognosis that the higher ed is at some point in the future will die, or certainly. I mean, you don't obviously buy that.
I'm always looking for who's going to kill it. We could kill it ourselves. Our research is still the envy of the world. Even in China, they know that 16 out of the top 25 research universities are American, and they publish it. They know the Chinese are trying like crazy. But the thing that makes America work in the universities in the fact that it's ungovernable.
Mhm.
And China is not going to permit that kind of freedom of mind and thought. No other country can allow that kind of nut farm that we have on these 6,000 campuses.
Wow. And again, the welcoming of these international students create another level of diversity for our campuses.
Absolutely. They come here in wonder. They love it here, but they want to go back to where, particularly Europeans, there's less risk.
Mhm.
We take kids who are already 4 years older. And I mean, in Europe, I think I said in the book, at the age of 11 or 12, they decide you're going to be a doctor, you're going to clean toilets. That's all done. We don't do that in this country. We say at the age of 40, you can start in a community college if you want. Do 2 years and get your bachelor's degree at the age of 44. Change your career 3 or 4 times. Take risks. And that's what we do. The largest American university college major is undecided.
Yeah. I was talking to the president of Gantcher College recently, and he was telling me that 100% of their students go abroad. And when did study abroad kind of take off? As
Senator Fulbright, another accident.
Mm.
After the war was over, he would come from a segregated state. He was part of the Southern Conservative coalition, but he was also a very smart man. He was president of the University of Arkansas at the age of 30, and he saw that there was so much war material left over in these other countries at the end of hostilities in 45. He said, why don't we sell it to them and let them pay it off in their currency, and then we'll give little bits to our students to go over and study abroad. And he said, he proposed the Fulbright Act. And Truman signed it, and it went into law. And the Fulbright Act, we got, I think, 60 Nobel Prize winners have been former Fulbrights. I got my first year of graduate study, or second year, on a Fulbright. We all went to Europe and studied, or Asia, or Africa, or around the world. So, but he had no idea how broad this program would be.
Wow. Fascinating. So tell me, what are you hopeful that folks will get from this book when they read it? I mean, again, just a lot of nuggets here.
They may realize how little memory they have.
Yeah.
And how much we do not study American history appropriately.
And can you be a prophetic a little bit? Can we look around the corner? What do you think is on?
I think the last line I said, prophet, who is going to pass us? Who is going to do it better? What we've created is unreplicable. You cannot replicate a system that's got a Hillsdale, a Providence College, a Holy Cross, Stanford. There's nothing, but then the State University, Michigan, UCLA, Berkeley. There's no place for that anywhere else in the world. It couldn't start the way. So that I keep looking and saying, who is going to push us off the mountain? And I don't see the nation out there that can do it.
And what do you make of all of these scandals, Varsity Blues and
People wanting to
every
pay to get their kids into better colleges,
yeah,
as American as apple pie.
nothing new about that. Yeah,
Nothing new,
yeah,
just the
interesting.
technology.
Interesting. Well, one of my favorite writers, Larry Ty, said that there's no more important story to be told at this moment in America than why higher education matters, and there's no more adept and engaging storyteller than Saul Gittleman. So thank you so much. Again, I would encourage everyone to get a copy of An Accidental Triumph, The Improbable History of American Higher Education. It's a wonderful read. And again, hearing your story and it's so fascinating, and so I want to thank you for your leadership and all the work that you've done. Now, last question for you: you're retired, or are you still kind of?
No, I'm retired.
You're retired, and do you miss
Boy, do
the
I not miss grading exams.
You say no, and I imagine those faculty meetings can be pretty rigorous as well.
I thought they were all funny
Yeah.
because the
Well, thank you.
faculty is such a funny bunch.
Yeah. Well, you were certainly one. So, again, I think that's the genius of the system that we have as well, is that you can start off as a faculty member and work your way up to become provost or president, and you have insight at all levels of the process, and I think that's really important as well. So,
Thank you.
thank you so much. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks a lot, Jamal.
All right.